The exit polls predict the return of Narendra Modi as the Prime Minister of India. Thanks for joining us. I'm Harsha Subramaniam. The question we are asking is, what would a second term for Modi mean for India? What are its implications on the idea of India as a diverse, secular, plural society, and what Indians stand for? Joining us to discuss that, Sadanand Dhume, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He joins us from New Delhi. James Crabtree, associate professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and author from Singapore. I'm also joined by Tony Joseph, journalist and author. Gentlemen, thank you so much indeed for joining us. James, I want to start this conversation with you. There is a view among a section of people that Modi's re-election would mean a narrow idea of India. So far, the India we know was celebrated in many flavors, but what may receive electoral endorsement is one idea, available in just one flavor, take it or leave it. Is this view misplaced?
I think amongst Indian liberals, there is a sense that if Modi comes back as the elected, as the polls suggest that he will, that in a sense this is going to be a kind of liberal apocalypse in which some of the trends that you saw in the first term of alarm amongst minorities or decline of institutions will accelerate very dramatically, that you'll see a scenario similar to Turkey or Russia. I don't think that's quite right. I mean, I think you're more likely to see a kind of continuation of what we saw in the first Modi term. That doesn't mean this is going to be a good outlook for Indian liberals or India's liberal tradition, but it doesn't mean that the collapse of the multicultural idea of India that you're talking about is going to happen imminently.
The other concern, gentlemen, is the mainstreaming of the fringe. Sadanand, in your piece in the Times of India recently, you point out, and I quote, that under Shah and Modi, the party's most glaring error concerned the mainstreaming of the proverbial fringe. That was obviously said in the context of Pragya Singh Thakur being given a ticket. What, to your mind, would a second innings for Modi mean in this context?
Well, that's really my biggest concern. It seems that on certain kinds of issues, particularly things that have to do with anti-Muslim bigotry, the ruling elite, and by this I mean the Prime Minister and the party president Amit Shah, they just have no sense of judgment. They have no brakes. They have no sort of no common sense. And there doesn't seem to be anybody else, either in the party or in government or outside government, who can sort of counsel them to take a wiser path. The most glaring example of this, of course, was the March 2017 appointment of Yogi Adityanath as Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, which is India's largest state. This is a person who had himself set up an anti-Muslim militia. This is a person who is responsible for some blood-curdling rhetoric about Muslims, something he speaks in terms of collective violence, collective retribution, and things like that. And so this is sort of someone who was so unsavory and someone regarded as so beyond the pale that he couldn't even be appointed a junior minister, and now he's heading India's largest state. Similarly, Pragya Singh Thakur, who is their candidate for Parliament from Bhopal, and by all accounts looks likely to win, this is a person who is under trial not for any ordinary garden variety sort of charges, but under terrorism charges. She's a person who there is credible evidence to suggest was implicated in a bomb blast that killed 6 Muslims, including a child. So these are extremely unsavory people. If the system was functioning properly and there was some kind of collective wisdom that was operating, someone would say that, hey, this is really going too far. It's not a good idea. It's destabilizing for India. It's also terrible for India's international image. You need to rethink this. Unfortunately, the India we're in today, there is nobody out there who can make that point.
Okay. Tony, you want to come in on this? Would an emboldened Modi mean one step closer to a Hindu Rashtra? The fear that he could go ahead and as far as changing the constitution, that seems a bit far-fetched to me, does it?
I think a lot depends on what kind of results we see tomorrow. If Modi comes back with an even larger numbers than in the last elections, or even if he remains where he was in the last elections, I think we can reasonably expect the dilution of the idea of a liberal democratic India to continue happening at a faster pace than in the last 5 years. The reason for this, I think, is that if you, any which way that you look at it, the last elections has to be, it's clear that they were won. That was a mandate mostly for development. because the main candidate, Modi himself, campaigned mostly on development, even though his party president did use very divisive language and tactics during the last elections too. But there is no doubt in anyone's mind that this election was not fought on development, it's not fought on Achhe Din, and it was mainly fought on issues that are divisive. And that was, very clear from the language that was used, the language of termites that was used for migrants in northeastern India, and how the methods of dealing with them in northeastern India will now be taken across to the rest of India. So it is very clear that if they come back with as much or a greater numbers than in the last elections, this is not a mandate for development, and they will be moving much faster towards the objectives of Hindutva. Okay. But if the results tomorrow show that the Modi government comes back to power with lesser majority than the last time, and has to depend on more allies perhaps, then I think there would be some restraint, and we will probably see a continuation of what we have seen in the last 5 years, or perhaps even a slightly slower dilution of our democratic liberal environment.
Sadanand, I want to come back to you. Will Modi's re-election reinvigorate the Hindu project? Is the Nehruvian construct of secularism dead in a sense? And will we see a resurgence of Hindu traditionalism or conservatism in many shades? I personally have no problems with that. The only question is, it could only be that. Could that be problematic?
Look, it's very clear that the Nehruvian consensus is dead one way or the other. Whether Modi comes back with a thumping majority, or even if he doesn't really come back with a huge majority, I think it's very clear that we're not going back to the past. The big question that faces India is what replaces it. Now, ideally, you would have some kind of commitment to pluralism that would continue, and that you could kind of, you can tweak what went wrong with the Nehruvian consensus, at least in terms of in practice, if not in theory, which was that it kind of had devolved into a pandering to the most hardline elements in the Muslim community in particular, and it really had sort of, it wasn't really secularism in the sense that we use that term in the West. Now, it's one thing to criticize the excesses or the evolution of Nehruvian secularism and what it had turned into. It's quite another thing to replace that with, frankly, an ideology that treats anybody who happens not to be born Hindu as somehow a lesser Indian. That's really the worry, that's the fear, that's the dividing line, and that's the concern that many of us have.
If James Crabtree, what would make Modi more acceptable? Let's say he takes action against vigilante violence. If he spoke out loud against trampling of civil liberties, would he become more acceptable? And to be fair, the BJP in the first term did not pass any new legislation that curbed civil liberties in any manner.
I think if he did that, then that would reassure people, but I see very little indication that he would. I mean, that is a political space in India that is open to Modi. He has the support already of the Hindu hardliners, and so in a sense he could take a position in which he banks that and tries to reach out to other groups, but he's never really done that, and so the idea that he would begin to do that in his second term, it seems rather far-fetched to me. I mean, I think the interesting thing is many liberals see this as a binary choice. You can either have a more Hindu nationalist model of governance, or you can have economic competence. And it's clear that Modi doesn't really believe that. He feels you can have both, and that was true in Gujarat, where his government was religiously divisive but economically successful. The problem on both fronts, however, is, as Sadanand said, that it's all a bit haphazard. The way in which the BJP has pushed forward its nationalist and religious nationalist agenda has been kind of not very well controlled, and its economic reform agenda has also been often much less competent than we thought. And I think that's the question for the second term. If they are going to move forward on a kind of process of creepingly increasing the power of the Hindu majority, are they going to do that in a measured way, or is it going to be haphazard and controlled by extremists? Are we going to see a measure of greater competence and direction in their economic reform program? And those seem to me both very open questions.
Okay, let me for a moment talk about the challenger as well. Tony Joseph, the Congress is obviously a pale shadow of its past. It's clutching at the straws to find an identity. It's trying to reclaim Hinduism from Hindutva. I mean, why hasn't the grand old party been able to offer a compelling alternative that people can relate to? Someone suggested a couple of days ago it's better for the Congress to die and create space for others. That may be a bit extreme, but where do you stand on this?
I completely agree with you that the Congress party has failed to live up to the challenge that faced it. This even after taking into account the fact that in these elections, I mean, I'm assuming that the results will go more or less according to what the opinion polls or what the exit polls say. If that is the reality, then it is clear that Congress has failed more or less to capitalize on the mistakes and on the failures of the government in power. The reason why it has not been able to do, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that it has not been able to break out of the fact that the party is controlled by a family, and it has not been able to grow out of it. It needs to grow out of it at some point or the other. And ironically, the only way it can be done if the president of the party, if the family itself realizes that they need to democratize the party and move out of the way. There's no other way it will happen, because the Congress, after Indira Gandhi turned it into a more personalized party a long time ago, it has lost its natural instincts, and it is afraid that it will not last any longer if there isn't the Gandhi family to hold it together.
Okay.
Now, so that's why the irony is that only the family can get the party out of the rut that it has gone into. But having said that, I think the most likely outcome of the elections probably is that Congress will still be better, will do better than what it did in the last elections. So that's where I see it.
Okay, so
but there is a challenge ahead, and that challenge.
Sure, I take your point, Tony. Sadanand, so here's what may lie ahead of us if these exit poll results were true. A heady cocktail of religious nationalism, joblessness, fake news, slow economic growth. All of these do not portend well for India at all, Sadanand. And the focus has always been, as you pointed out in a recent article, that India, on how India can move faster and faster. But perhaps there is merit for India to slow down a bit, isn't it?
Well, in fairness, we really don't know, right? I mean, we don't know, for instance, for certain whether they're going to get their act together on the economy. I think there's a reason to be skeptical about their commitment to economic reform, but I can't sort of, predict with great clarity that we're going to have joblessness. I think you can be pretty sure that they're going to continue with fake news, because that's kind of, the fake news structures are very kind of deeply linked with the ruling party, and they don't seem to have any kind of moral and ethical qualms about this. But I want to quickly get back to the point about the Congress party, and one way of looking at it is that it's actually quite remarkable that the Congress party in its present form has survived for this long, right? For most of the past 70 years, the most competent and compelling politician in India has been a member of the family. In 1959 it was Jawaharlal Nehru, in 1969 it was Indira Gandhi. You could argue that in 1989 it was Rajiv Gandhi, or at least in 1984 it was Rajiv Gandhi, and in 2009 it was Sonia Gandhi. Now what you have is a situation where they are, because of the nature of the party, because of the fact that it's been a family firm for 50 years now, it has to be led by a member of the family. But the member of the family who they've chosen now, Rahul Gandhi, is just not a very good politician. And this is the fundamental problem that the Congress faces. I don't know how they're going to find a way out of it.
James, you want to comment on this? Whether the Congress has a possibility, and the point that I made about the mix, a heady cocktail of joblessness and religious nationalism, and what that could mean.
I mean, the Congress are in a very difficult position. I think many observers had, in a sense, misinterpreted signs of life in the Congress party. The fact that Rahul, they won the 3 state-level elections at the tail end of last year, that Rahul appeared to be making some headway on the Rafale issue, that there were at least some policies being emerged, particularly their quasi-universal basic income. People misinterpreted that as a sign of health, whereas, to the extent that it was possible to imagine a Congress modernization project under the Gandhi family, it clearly hasn't been anywhere near as thoroughgoing as it needed to be. And the big problem that you have is that it's impossible to renew the party either institutionally or personally while you have this single family that has its lockhold over the leadership. And I suppose my sense is that what will happen is, unfortunately, that Congress will struggle on before, that they will start, they did slightly better this time, and they'll start looking at the UP elections in 2021 as being the next big kind of objective to try and rebuild the party. But I don't see a very positive scenario absent the BJP really making a huge mess of things.
Okay, I have time for just one final question, and this is nothing to do with what political parties can do. Tony Joseph, last word with you. The bigot today is no longer a saffron-clad or a white-robed charlatan. He's actually your neighbor. He's your colleague working a few cubicles away in your office in Gurgaon or in Lower Parel. And he's the guy who's abusing you on Twitter, anonymously, of course. Is this hatred, this anger, this polarization inescapable, whoever comes to power?
First, I agree completely with you. And I think one of the main things that one has noticed is that in 2014, many of the people who voted for BJP felt the need to say that they're voting not because of their social agenda, but because of the economic agenda. And that has changed radically in the last 5 years. The same people who had to take cover under, maybe it was not a cover, maybe it was the real situation, have rapidly changed to a situation where they do not have any hesitation in saying that the reason why they vote for Modi is because they identify with the agenda, social agenda of the party. And this is something that has happened across the board in a large way. To that extent, the BJP has succeeded in taking its message of Hindutva and its idea of how India should be structured much more popular. And it is there. It is here to stay with us for a long time. But I think that does not mean that all is lost from a liberal democratic point of view, because I think the natural instincts of the Indian civilization has always been to be inclusive. And we might be passing through a period of where that doesn't seem to be the case. But I think the natural instincts will prevail over time.
Sadanand, you want to respond to this?
Yeah, I think that the question of bigotry, I think, having become mainstreamed or having sort of risen out of it's pretty obvious, right? You just turn on your television and the kinds of things that people say today would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. But at the same time, I do not think that society at large has lurched severely in one direction. I think what's happened instead is that you have a group of people who have these views, who feel emboldened and empowered. Technology has also played a role in this, as has the ruling party and its structures. And most people, most regular people, are just passive. It's not as though the guy next to you in your office is sort of waking up every day and saying, I hate Muslims. It's just that he doesn't really care particularly about the guy in the next table who is. So, in some ways, you can say that this is obviously concerning, but I would say that it's a little bit less alarming than at least the picture that you portrayed.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Many thanks indeed for joining us with your perspectives. Sadanand Dumek, James Crabtree, Tony Joseph, many thanks indeed for joining us today. If you have been, thank you so much for watching.